There was a time when Ethan Graves was untouchable. His name was printed in every financial magazine. They called him the architect of fortune, a man who built an empire from nothing, a visionary, a leader, a billionaire whose every word moved the market. But in less than 48 hours, that same name became poison. They came for him one morning, agents, reporters, and handcuffs. The world watched as the man who once signed million-dollar deals in glass towers was dragged down the marble steps of his own mansion in chains. Ethan didn't resist. He just looked lost, as if he couldn't believe the world he built had turned on him overnight. The charges? Corporate fraud? Money laundering? Embezzlement of over $300 million? Every news channel in the country ran the same story. Billionaire Ethan Graves, arrested in largest financial scandal of the decade. But only one person inside that mansion didn't believe it. Her name was Grace Miller. Grace had worked there for 6 years. A black maid from South Carolina, soft-spoken, careful, invisible to most. She cleaned the halls where millionaires met. She heard things, quiet whispers, nervous deals, but never repeated a word. And through all those years, Ethan had treated her kindly. He never saw her as just the help. He said thank you. He remembered her birthday. He even paid for her son's community college tuition without telling anyone. So when she saw the headlines that morning, her hands shook. Not because she feared losing her job, but because something didn't add up. Ethan wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a thief, and Grace had seen men far greedier than him walk free. When Grace first visited Ethan in jail, the guards laughed. A maid visiting her billionaire boss? One of them muttered, but she ignored them. Ethan sat on the other side of the glass, his suit traded for an orange jumpsuit. He looked older, tired, defeated. The man who once commanded boardrooms now struggled to hold back tears. Ethan, softly, "They've frozen everything. My accounts, my assets, my life." Grace, gently, "Mr. Graves, I don't believe what they're saying." Ethan bitterly laughs. "Grace, the world does. My lawyer dropped me this morning, said I was too toxic to represent." He paused, looking down at his cuffed hands. They all left. Every friend, every partner, even my ex-wife's pretending she never knew me. Grace watched him, not with pity, but with quiet resolve. Something inside her refused to believe this was how his story would end. That night, Grace sat in her small apartment on the edge of town, her son asleep, the TV still buzzing with breaking news. She stared at Ethan's picture, his arrest photo, and something inside her stirred. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe it was justice, maybe it was faith. Whatever it was, it whispered, "Don't let him fall alone." She remembered how, years ago, Ethan had told her, "Grace, loyalty is rare. Most people stay until the storm comes, then they leave." And now, the storm had come for him, and Grace Miller decided she wouldn't leave. Reporters shouted as Grace walked through the crowd. She wore her maid's uniform. She hadn't had time or money for anything else. Is that the maid? Does she work for Graves? What's she doing here? She ignored the questions, her eyes locked on Ethan, who stood alone in front of the court, no lawyer beside him. The man who once had 10 attorneys now had none. She could see it, fear in his eyes, shame in his shoulders. Everyone was watching him, waiting for him to fall. And that's when she said it. Not loudly, not for the cameras, but with a strength that made him turn. "Grace, I will defend you." Ethan, stunned. "Grace, you don't even have a law degree." Grace, quietly. "Then I'll learn what I have to. I don't know how, but I know you're innocent." The guards laughed. The reporters smirked. But Ethan smiled for the first time in days, because for the first time since his arrest, someone still believed in him. That was the moment everything changed. The moment a quiet maid from a forgotten neighborhood became the only person willing to stand beside a man the world wanted to destroy. Grace didn't know the law. She didn't have money. She didn't have power. But she had truth. And she had courage. And sometimes that's all it takes to shake an empire. What Grace didn't know was that powerful men were already planning to silence her. Because the secret behind Ethan's arrest was darker than anyone imagined. When Grace Miller walked out of that courthouse, she wasn't just a maid anymore. She was the only person in that entire city willing to stand beside a broken man everyone else had abandoned. But she didn't realize what she was stepping into. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, and the people who'd do anything to keep it. Grace sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold. Papers were spread everywhere, printed news stories, bank statements she had found in Ethan's old office, a few torn pages from his calendar. Her son, Caleb, rubbed his eyes and came out of his room. Caleb, sleepy. "Mom, you didn't sleep again?" Grace, forcing a smile. "I will, baby. Just trying to understand something, Caleb." "About Mr. Graves?" Grace. "Yes. About why good people get blamed when bad ones hide behind them." Caleb nodded. He was 16, old enough to understand struggle, but too young to see how cruel the world could be. He didn't know his mother was about to walk into a fight most people wouldn't survive. That same morning, Grace took the bus into town, to the law library near the courthouse. She had never been inside before. The guard at the door gave her a long, skeptical look. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Yes," she said simply. "I need to learn how to defend someone." He chuckled at first, then realized she was serious, and he stepped aside. For weeks, Grace came there every morning. She read every beginner's book on criminal defense, every case similar to Ethan's. She asked questions, took notes, copied pages until her hands ached. The librarians started to whisper. Some mocked her. Others admired her determination. But no one, not one, offered help. Ethan sat alone in his cell, staring at the wall. The silence was heavy, the betrayal heavier. A folded note slid under his door. He opened it. It was unsigned. Only 3 words. "Don't trust anyone." He looked up, startled, but there was no one in the hall. That night, a guard whispered to him through the bars. "Word is, your old business partner, Leonard Huxley, is talking. Says you signed every illegal deal yourself." Ethan froze. Leonard, the man he'd built everything with, the man who had been like a brother to him. He understood now. Someone had set him up. But how could he prove it, when the world had already decided he was guilty? That same week, Grace received a call from an unknown number. Grace. "Hello?" Female voice. "Stop digging into Ethan Graves' case. You're making powerful people nervous, Grace. Who is this?" Click. The line went dead. She looked out her window. A dark sedan was parked across the street. It didn't move for hours. Grace didn't tell Caleb. She didn't even tell Ethan. But fear was crawling up her spine like ice. Still, she kept going. Grace walked into the courthouse carrying a small folder. Inside, copies of company statements she'd found in Ethan's old desk. Most people didn't notice her, but one young intern at the clerk's desk did. Intern. "Ma'am, you can't just bring papers like that." "Are you a lawyer?" Grace, quietly. "No, but I believe my friend was framed." These might prove it. The intern hesitated. He looked around. No supervisors nearby. He lowered his voice. "Intern, if you really believe that, you should talk to a man named Charles Odom. Retired attorney. He comes here every Thursday, sits on that bench reading old case files. He used to work for the district attorney's office." Grace thanked him and waited. An hour later, an older black man in a worn gray suit walked in. He looked like someone who had seen too many battles, both in court and in life. Grace, approaching. "Mr. Odom," he looked up. "Odom, Do I know you? Grace. No, sir. But I think you might be the only person who can help me. Over the next few days, Grace told Odom everything about Ethan's arrest, the missing lawyer, the suspicious documents, the phone calls. Odom listened without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back, sighed deeply, and said, Odom, child, you're walking into a lion's den, but I'll tell you this. Most people don't fight because they think they can't win. You're fighting because you can't stand injustice. That's a different kind of strength. He agreed to look over the documents. 2 days later, he called her back. Odom, Grace, these numbers don't lie. The money trail leads to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under Leonard Huxley's name. Not Ethan's. Grace's heart pounded. Grace. So he framed him. Odom, yes. And whoever helped him made sure every trace pointed to Ethan. Grace. Can this prove his innocence? Odom, quietly. It can start a war. Grace didn't care about war. She cared about truth. But soon she'd learn truth has a price. That night, her apartment window shattered. A brick crashed through, wrapped in a note. Last warning. Drop the case, Caleb screamed. Grace held him tight, her heart racing. She knew what this meant. She was getting close. Ethan saw the bruise on her hand and the fear in her eyes. Ethan, concerned. Grace, what happened? Grace, softly. They're scared, Mr. Graves. That's how I know we're close. Ethan, Grace, you shouldn't risk your life for me. Grace, you risked your life's work for people who never thanked you. I can risk mine for justice. Ethan looked at her, truly looked. This woman, who once mopped his floors and stayed invisible in the background, was now the only person standing between him and ruin. He whispered, You have more courage than anyone I've ever met. And Grace answered quietly, Maybe I just have nothing left to lose. Word spread across the small town. People whispered about the maid trying to play lawyer. Some mocked her. Some admired her. Most just waited to see her fail. But Grace didn't care about them. She kept digging, visiting the courthouse, interviewing clerks, copying old contracts, and piecing together a trail no one else had bothered to follow. And what she found next would change everything. Hidden deep inside one of the files Odom helped her access, Grace found something. A digital timestamp on a transfer receipt. The date proved that the fraudulent money movement happened after Ethan was already under arrest. In other words, he couldn't have done it. It was the proof she needed. But now, she had to get it into the courtroom. And with no lawyer left, only one choice remained. She'd have to do it herself. A maid, a billionaire, and a truth powerful enough to destroy the people who thought they owned justice. Grace Miller was done being invisible, and the next time she stepped into that courtroom, she wouldn't be there to clean. She'd be there to fight. The day of the hearing arrived. The town had been waiting for this moment. The fall of a billionaire made for good headlines. Reporters packed the front steps, camera flashes cut through the gray morning, and in the middle of it all, walked a maid in a faded blue dress holding a worn-out folder. Grace Miller, the woman everyone thought was out of her mind. Reporter, is that her? The maid? Bystander. Yeah. She says she's going to defend him. Reporter. Defend him? She's not even a lawyer. But Grace didn't hear them. She walked slowly, with the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived worse than ridicule. Ethan was brought in, handcuffed, surrounded by guards. When he saw her, something softened in his eyes. Ethan, you actually came. Grace. I said I would. He gave a faint smile, a man with nothing left but faith in one person. The judge entered, the crowd rose, and as they sat back down, whispers rippled through the room like a storm. Ethan's lawyer chair was empty. Judge, Mr. Graves, where is your counsel? Ethan hesitated. Grace stood up before he could speak. Grace, Your Honor. His lawyer abandoned him. I'm here to speak on his behalf. The courtroom went silent. The judge raised an eyebrow. Judge, and who might you be, miss? Grace, my name is Grace Miller. I worked as Mr. Graves' housekeeper for 6 years. Gasps, laughter from the audience. Even the prosecutor smiled mockingly. Judge, Miss Miller, you're not a licensed attorney. Grace, no, Your Honor, but I have something no one else here seems to have. The truth. The judge paused, studying her. He saw sincerity, desperation, courage, and against his better judgment he nodded. Judge, proceed. But know this, one misstep, and I'll end this immediately. Grace bowed her head slightly. Yes, Your Honor. Grace stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. She placed her folder on the table, the one she had carried for weeks. It wasn't a lawyer's binder. It was a collection of crumpled papers, notes, and printed evidence she'd pieced together like a puzzle. She took a breath, looked up, and began. Grace, Mr. Graves is being accused of transferring stolen funds through a shell company. But I've reviewed those transfers, Your Honor, and something doesn't make sense. Prosecutor, objection. She's not qualified to interpret financial data. Judge, overruled for now. Let her finish, Grace. The transfers supposedly happened while Mr. Graves was under arrest, locked in county jail. He didn't have access to his accounts, his devices, or his company servers, which means someone else made those moves, someone with his clearance. The courtroom shifted. Murmurs filled the air. Grace turned to face the prosecutor. Her eyes, calm but unyielding, met his. Grace. And that someone was Leonard Huxley. The prosecutor froze. For the first time, his smirk faltered. Grace, I have documents showing the funds were transferred to a company registered offshore, under Huxley's name. And the timestamp on the transfer log proves Mr. Graves couldn't have done it. Judge, do you have proof of this timestamp? Grace opened her folder, hands shaking, and handed over the printed evidence. The judge examined it. The prosecutor stepped forward quickly. Prosecutor, that's inadmissible. It hasn't been verified. Judge, perhaps not yet, but if verified, this could change everything. He looked at Grace again. Miss Miller, how did you obtain these records? Grace, I found them in the old files Mr. Graves left behind, and I had help, a retired attorney who confirmed their authenticity. The judge leaned back, eyes narrowing. Mr. Odom? Grace blinked in surprise. Yes, sir. The judge smiled faintly. Good man. Hard to fool him. For the next hour, Grace stood alone against trained lawyers, sharp objections, and relentless questions. But she never backed down. She spoke not like someone trying to win, but like someone begging for truth to be seen. Her voice cracked, her hands trembled, but her heart was unbreakable. Every word she spoke came from conviction, not legal training, and sometimes conviction speaks louder than degrees. The prosecutor leaned toward his assistant. Where did she get this? I told Huxley those files were destroyed. His assistant whispered back, she shouldn't have access to that evidence, unless someone inside helped her. The prosecutor looked nervous now. For the first time, the case was slipping. Judge, Miss Miller, I must say, your presentation is unorthodox, but you've raised serious questions about this prosecution's foundation. Prosecutor, Your Honor, she's misleading the court. Judge, enough. He turned to the courtroom. This court will recess for 48 hours. During that time, I will request independent verification of the timestamps and financial records presented today. He looked directly at Grace. Miss Miller, you've earned this pause. Use it wisely. Grace bowed slightly, tears glimmering, but held back. Thank you, Your Honor. As she walked out of the courthouse, the same reporters who mocked her before now rushed forward. Reporter: Grace? Are you really defending him alone? Grace: I'm not defending a billionaire. I'm defending the truth. Flashes burst around her. For the first time, the world saw her, not as a maid, but as a fighter. Odom was waiting for her on the porch. Odom: You shook that courtroom today? Grace: I just told the truth. Odom: Truth can be dangerous, Grace. You saw what they did already. If this evidence holds, Huxley won't just lose money, he'll lose everything. And men like him, they don't go down quietly. Grace: Then I'll make sure he doesn't stand back up. Odom nodded slowly. There was something unbreakable in her voice now, a strength that could only come from pain turned into purpose. But even as Grace celebrated a small victory, danger was closing in. That night, as she walked inside, a shadow lingered near her apartment window. A phone call was made, short and cold. She's getting too close. Handle it. The next morning, a black car followed her on the road to the courthouse. Grace noticed it in her rearview mirror. She didn't panic. She just whispered to herself, "Not today." Inside her bag was a flash drive, a backup of all her evidence. She had given another copy to Odom just in case something happened to her. And she was right too, because that day, the twist she never saw coming wasn't about who framed Ethan. It was about who had helped them. Grace believed she was fighting against corruption inside a corporation, but the truth was much darker. The betrayal came from inside the system itself. The same lawyer who abandoned Ethan was being paid to keep him silent. By the time the trial began, Grace Miller wasn't the Maid anymore. She had become a story, whispered on talk shows, debated online, shared by millions. Some called her crazy, others called her brave. But Grace didn't care what they called her, because she knew this wasn't just Ethan's fight anymore. It was hers too. Courtroom, 8 a.m., flashes from cameras outside, reporters calling her name. The doors opened, and Ethan Graves entered in a gray suit. The same man once crushed under shame, now standing taller, calmer. He turned to Grace, sitting quietly at the defense table, surrounded by piles of folders and handwritten notes. She didn't have a degree. She didn't have an office, but she had truth, and she carried it like a shield. Ethan: You don't have to do this, Grace. Grace: I told you, sir. I'll defend you till the truth speaks louder than lies. Judge: Court is now in session. The state versus Ethan Graves. Counsel, are you ready to proceed? The prosecution stood. Sleek suits, sharp smiles, polished arrogance. They were confident. Too confident. Grace could feel it. They already thought they'd won. Prosecutor: The state is ready, Your Honor. Though I do wonder, who exactly is representing the defendant today? He glanced toward Grace like she was an intruder. Judge: Miss Miller, do you have counsel credentials to speak on Mr. Graves's behalf? Grace stood. Her voice was steady, even as her hands trembled. Grace: Your Honor, I'm not a licensed attorney. I'm a citizen and a witness. But I have evidence that this court needs to see. Evidence that proves the man you're accusing is innocent. The room buzzed with shock. Reporters started typing. Cameras clicked like gunfire. Judge, this is highly irregular, Miss Miller. Grace: I understand, Your Honor. But so is charging a man with a crime the government's own records can't prove. A murmur rippled through the court. The judge leaned forward. Judge: Proceed carefully, Miss Miller. You have 5 minutes. Grace took a breath and began. Grace: 3 weeks ago, I went back to the Graves Foundation, the charity Ethan built for foster youth. Everyone said the files were destroyed, but I found backups, hidden in the basement, financial ledgers, time-stamped transactions, and emails. Emails from Mr. Graves's so-called financial director, Paul Harlow. She clicked on a USB drive connected to a small laptop. The screen lit up in the courtroom. Grace. Those transfers? The $300 million they said Ethan stole? They weren't going to his account. They were going to Harlow's shell company. The same man who accused Ethan of fraud was the one orchestrating it. The prosecutor's face drained of color. Grace, and when I cross-referenced the transaction IDs, I found something else. The same offshore accounts connected to politicians and investors who funded the investigation against him. Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge's eyes widened slightly. Judge, you're claiming this entire case was fabricated? Grace, I'm not claiming it, Your Honor. I'm proving it. She pulled out a printed letter, slightly crumpled, but stamped with the seal of the U.S. Treasury Department. Grace, this letter confirms those accounts were under investigation months before Ethan was arrested. But someone powerful, made sure his name was the one on the warrant. Prosecutor, objection! This woman is not a legal representative. This evidence is... Judge overruled. The court will examine the evidence. Grace, you didn't want this coming out, did you? The prosecutor glared at her, his jaw tight. But Grace didn't stop. She played a short audio clip, a recording of a phone call she had found between Paul Harlow and an unknown official. Once Graves is charged, move the money out of the Cayman account. The press will bury him before he even gets a trial. The courtroom froze. Ethan's eyes glistened, disbelief and relief colliding in his chest. For months, he had lived under the weight of lies. And now, for the first time, the truth began to crawl out from beneath them. But truth doesn't come without enemies. Because when Grace exposed those files, she didn't just save Ethan, she threatened men who built empires on corruption. Reporters swarmed Grace as she left that day. Flashes, microphones, voices shouting over each other. Grace! Who gave you those files? Are you accusing the government of framing him? Do you realize what you've just done? She didn't answer. She just said softly, Grace, the truth doesn't need permission. The TV blared with news coverage. Ethan's name was trending again, but this time, not as a criminal. Anchor. Breaking. New evidence suggests the billionaire's fraud case may have been built on falsified documents. The whistleblower? His former housekeeper, Grace Miller. Grace sat alone, her son asleep in the next room. Outside, rain hit the windows. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate, because she knew what came next. Retaliation. And she was right. She froze. The knocking grew louder. Miss Miller? Federal agents. We need to speak with you. Her heart pounded, but something felt wrong. No ID, no warrant, no badges. She looked through the peephole. 2 men in dark coats. Too calm. Too deliberate. Grace quietly picked up her phone and called Ethan. Ethan. Grace? What's wrong? Grace. They're here. 2 men outside. I don't think they're police, Ethan. Listen to me. Stay inside. Don't open that door. I'll call the authorities. The men kept knocking. Harder now. Man, Miss Miller, this is urgent. It's about your testimony tomorrow. Grace held her breath. Then, silence. When she finally peeked again, they were gone. But on her doormat, a single envelope. Inside, a note. Stop talking, or your son will. Grace had uncovered the truth, but truth always comes with a price. That night, she held her son close and realized she was fighting something far bigger than a trial. She was fighting a system built to bury people like her. Despite the threat, Grace showed up. Her eyes tired, her hands shaking. But she was there. Ethan saw her enter and stood beside her. Ethan, you didn't have to come. Grace, yes, I did. Because if I stop now, they win. When the judge entered, Grace requested to testify again, this time under oath. Judge, Miss Miller, you've already provided key evidence. Do you wish to add more? Grace, yes, Your Honor. Because this isn't just about one man's innocence. It's about who gets to decide what justice looks like. She looked toward the prosecutor's table, the same men who laughed when she first spoke. Grace, when I started cleaning offices, I heard men talk about how money buys silence. They were right. Until today, the courtroom was dead silent. Grace's words cut through like thunder. Grace, I may not know the law like they do, but I know the difference between guilt and greed. And I know this man behind me, Ethan Graves, built jobs, paid families, gave second chances. He didn't steal a thing. But these men, they stole his name, his dignity, his future. And if I stay silent, then I'm no better than them. Tears streamed down her face, but her voice never broke. It wasn't just a statement. It was a storm. Even the judge looked shaken. Because in that moment, Grace wasn't speaking as a maid or a witness. She was speaking as the voice of every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong in the room. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. Judge. After reviewing the new evidence and recorded communications, this court finds the defendant, Ethan Graves, not guilty on all counts. A wave of emotion broke through the room. Ethan lowered his head, not in pride, but in disbelief. Grace covered her face, whispering a silent prayer of thanks. Outside, cameras waited to capture their fall, but instead, they captured their redemption. Ethan turned to Grace. He didn't speak at first. Then, with tears in his eyes, Ethan, I had all the money in the world, and still, you were the only person who stood by me. Grace, you once told me loyalty was rare. I just wanted to prove it still exists. Ethan chuckled softly. Then he said words the world would remember. Ethan, from this day forward, you're not my maid, Grace. You're my defender. And just like that, the world that once mocked her now honored her. TV headlines read, Housekeeper exposes billion-dollar corruption scandal. Grace Miller, the woman who fought the system and won. But Grace didn't want fame. She wanted change. So together, she and Ethan started something new, the Miller Graves Foundation for Justice, a legal aid network for those who couldn't afford a voice, because sometimes it only takes one voice to remind the world that truth still matters. Ethan Graves lost his fortune, but gained something far greater, redemption. And Grace Miller? She was never just a maid. She was proof that courage doesn't need permission. Justice had finally spoken. The billionaire everyone condemned was free, and the maid the world ignored became a symbol of courage. But stories like these don't end in the courtroom. They begin there. Because when the truth exposes power, power always tries to fight back. It had been 3 weeks since the verdict. Grace woke to the sound of her phone buzzing, hundreds of notifications, interviews, articles, speaking offers. The world wanted to hear her story, but Grace didn't want microphones. She wanted peace. She brewed coffee quietly as her son, Marcus, got ready for school. He looked up at her and said with pride, Marcus, Mom, everyone at school's talking about you. They said you're a hero. Grace smiled faintly, brushing his cheek. Grace, I'm just a mom who told the truth, baby. That's all. The morning sun felt different that day, brighter, softer, but with every sunrise came new shadows. Ethan Graves sat at a desk scattered with documents. The empire he once ruled had been dismantled, sold off, or seized. He wasn't rebuilding it for money. He was rebuilding it for meaning. Across from him sat Grace, notebook in hand. Ethan, I spoke with our attorneys. The Miller Graves Foundation is officially approved. We'll open the first center here in the city. Pro bono legal aid, outreach, advocacy. Grace nodded, overwhelmed. Grace, I still can't believe it, Mr. Graves. A month ago, I was cleaning offices. Now you're putting my name on a building. Ethan, smiling. You earned it, Grace. You reminded me what worth really means. He paused, his tone softer. Ethan, you didn't just save me from prison. You saved me from becoming like them. Grace blinked back tears. Grace, then let's make sure no one else ever has to fight alone. Reporters lined up, capturing every word. Grace stood behind the podium, calm, composed, no script in hand. Grace, I was never supposed to be here. I was supposed to stay silent, stay small. But silence protects the powerful, and I chose not to protect them anymore. The crowd erupted into applause, but far away, in a dimly lit office overlooking the city, two men watched the broadcast in silence. One of them, the same official from the leaked recording. Man number one, she's becoming a problem. Man number two, she's already a problem. We underestimated her once. Never again. He closed his laptop. On the screen, a still image of Grace at the podium, smiling. Man number two, heroes make the best targets. When you shine a light on corruption, you don't just reveal the truth. You expose those who built their power in the dark. And now, Grace Miller had done exactly that. Rain tapped against the windshield. She turned on the radio. A familiar voice. Radio host. And while Grace Miller is being celebrated as a hero, sources claim her evidence was illegally obtained. Could she face charges herself? Grace's grip tightened on the steering wheel. Grace, they're starting again. Her phone buzzed, a blocked number. You should have stayed quiet, Grace. You think freeing one man changes the system. It doesn't, but you can disappear, and no one will remember. The line went dead. Grace sat frozen, heart pounding. Then she whispered to herself, Grace, not this time. Not again. Grace stormed in, dripping wet, envelope in hand. Grace, they're trying to discredit me, Ethan. They're saying I stole evidence, that I hacked the files. Ethan frowned, taking the papers from her. Ethan, they're desperate, they're cornered, but you're not alone this time. Grace, they're powerful, Ethan. If they can frame you once, they can bury me 10 times over. Ethan, then we fight them again. Together, he handed her a folder. Inside, new names, signatures, offshore accounts. Ethan, they're connected to a network that's been laundering money through political campaigns. The same people who funded Harlow's cover-up. Grace looked up, fear and determination battling in her eyes. Grace, if we expose this, they'll come for us both. Ethan, then let them come. Truth is like fire. It doesn't just burn lies, it burns everything built around them. And Grace was about to light another match. Grace testified again, this time before a government ethics committee. Her evidence didn't just clear Ethan. It connected corruption from corporate boardrooms all the way to political offices. The same men who had laughed in the courtroom months ago now refused to meet her gaze. Committee chair. Ms. Miller, do you understand the gravity of these accusations? Grace. I do, sir. And I also understand what happens when no one has the courage to make them. Headlines flash across screens. Whistleblower or criminal. Grace Miller accused of leaking classified data. Ethan Graves' Maid faces investigation. Protesters outside the courthouse, some chanting her name, others calling her a fraud. Grace walks past them silently, eyes forward. When you stand for truth, the world won't always stand with you. Sometimes it turns on you because the truth makes people uncomfortable. Marcus sat beside her, holding her hand. Marcus. Mom, are we going to be okay? She smiled faintly. Grace, yeah, baby. Because even if they take everything away, they can't take what's right. She kissed his forehead and whispered, Grace, courage isn't about winning, Marcus. It's about showing up when the world tells you not to. Ethan, Grace Miller didn't break the law. She broke the silence. And if we punish people for that, then we've already lost what justice means. Applause erupted, cameras flashed. But among the crowd, a familiar figure watched from the shadows, Paul Harlow. He was free on bail, smiling slightly, whispering to his lawyer. Harlow, you can't kill a symbol, but you can make people stop believing in it. And for a time, it almost worked. Sponsors pulled out. The foundation lost funding. Grace's reputation was attacked in the press, her son bullied at school, her life threatened more than once. But every time they tried to break her, she grew stronger. A pastor approached her gently. Pastor, you did what was right, Grace. Don't let fear convince you otherwise, Grace. I didn't think truth would hurt this much. Pastor, the truth hurts, but lies kill, and you've saved more people than you realize. After months of attacks, investigations, and endless trials, Grace's name was cleared once again. The corruption ring was exposed. Paul Harlow was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. The Miller Graves Foundation reopened, not as a building, but as a movement. Grace walked onto the small stage, no cameras this time, just families, volunteers, and young people who'd found hope because of her story. Grace, I've been called a maid, a liar, a criminal, and a hero. But I'm none of those things. I'm just someone who refused to walk away. And I hope, when your moment comes, you won't walk away either. That night, as the sun set behind the city, Grace and Ethan stood together on the balcony of their new center. The sky burned gold. The city hummed below. Ethan, quietly, you changed everything, Grace. Grace. No, Mr. Graves. We just reminded the world what justice looks like, when it has a face. Some battles don't end with applause. They end in quiet victories, in lives changed, in voices heard, in hope restored. And for Grace Miller, that was enough. Marcus holds her hand, smiling up at her. Marcus, Mom, are you happy now? Grace looks ahead, her eyes tired but bright. Grace, I am, baby, because the truth didn't break us. It made us free, inspired by those who refused to stay silent. Grace Miller and Ethan Graves founded the Miller Graves Foundation in 2025, now providing legal aid to hundreds of families across the U.S. Because sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear courage. The officers shoved Ethan through the courthouse doors. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions that stabbed like knives. Mr. Graves, did you really steal from your investors? Is it true you paid off government officials? Where's your lawyer now? He tried to keep his head high, but the weight of shame pressed down like a storm cloud. Inside, his once trusted lawyer, Richard Cole, stood waiting, his eyes cold, distant. Ethan, I can't represent you anymore, he said flatly. Ethan froze. What are you talking about? The trial starts in an hour. Richard adjusted his tie. You're finished. No firm will touch you. You're toxic.
He handed over a manila envelope, the termination notice, and walked away without another word. The billionaire's world, once built on loyalty and power, was collapsing faster than he could breathe. The guards led him into a holding cell, a narrow concrete box that reeked of disinfectant and regret. His designer suit was now crumpled, his hands trembling. He sat on the edge of the metal bench, staring at the cracks on the wall, each one looking like a scar on his life. For the first time in decades, Ethan Graves, the man who could buy anything, realized there was nothing left to buy that could save him. Hours later, after the chaos died down, the only person who came to see him wasn't a lawyer, a business partner, or a friend. It was Grace Miller, the maid. She entered quietly, clutching a small paper bag with sandwiches she'd made herself. Her uniform was clean but faded, and her eyes held something Ethan hadn't seen in weeks: compassion. The officer at the door frowned. 5 minutes, lady. Grace nodded and stepped closer. Mr. Graves, she said softly. You haven't eaten in 2 days. Ethan lifted his eyes, tired and broken. Grace, you shouldn't be here. I should, she said firmly. Because everyone else left you. He laughed bitterly. That's because they're smart. Grace placed the sandwich on the table between them. No, it's because they don't know who you really are. Ethan looked at her, really looked, and for the first time he noticed the strength in her voice. The quiet courage. He remembered hiring her 5 years ago. She was just a maid, invisible to everyone. But now, in this dark cell, she was the only one who hadn't turned away. Grace sat down. Mr. Graves, I know you didn't do what they say. I've seen the kind of man you are. You treated us, your staff, with respect when no one was watching. I believe you. Her words cracked through the silence. Ethan swallowed hard. Belief won't change the verdict, Grace. I've lost everything. My name, my freedom, even my lawyer. She leaned forward. Then I'll find someone else. I'll help you. He shook his head. You don't understand. No one will touch this case. Grace straightened her shoulders. Then I will. Ethan blinked. You? She nodded. I may not know the law like they do, but I know what's right. And I know when a man's being framed. He wanted to laugh again, but couldn't. Something in her eyes, fierce, unshakable, silenced him. That night, after leaving the detention center, Grace walked through the rain back to her tiny apartment. The city lights reflected off the puddles and her mind raced. She thought about the files she'd cleaned off his desk, the late-night calls he never told anyone about, the day he mentioned a missing report from his accounting team, and how his partner, Victor Hale, brushed it off. Pieces were starting to fit together. She didn't have a law degree, but she had something the others didn't, a memory of everything the powerful ignored. By midnight, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by scraps of paper, trying to trace the trail of lies that led to Ethan's downfall. The maid had become an investigator. Meanwhile, in his cell, Ethan sat alone. The lights dimmed. He thought about his empire, now ashes. But somewhere in the chaos, Grace's words echoed in his mind. Then I will. And for the first time since his arrest, he felt a flicker of hope. Rain poured outside the courthouse the next morning. A gray dawn crawled over the city, cold and unforgiving. News vans lined the streets, broadcasting Ethan Graves' fall from grace to every screen in America. In the headlines, he was already guilty. In the public's eyes, he was already forgotten. But not to her. Grace Miller stood across the street, clutching a folder of newspaper clippings, receipts, and handwritten notes. Her hair was pulled back, her old coat soaked through. She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't even sure what she was doing here. But she knew one thing. Ethan Graves didn't deserve to rot for something he didn't do. At the courthouse gate, a guard frowned. You again? Visiting hours are over. Grace held up the paper bag she'd brought. It's just food, please. The guard sighed. You've got 10 minutes. When Ethan saw her enter, his face softened with disbelief. You came back. Grace gave a small smile. I told you I would. Ethan leaned forward, lowering his voice. Grace, you don't understand how dangerous this is. The people who did this, they have money, power, reach. I don't care, she interrupted quietly. You once told me you built your company by standing up when others told you to sit down. I guess it's my turn now. He looked at her, this woman who used to polish the floors of his mansion, now standing before him with the same fire he used to have. She opened her folder. I started going through old documents. Receipts, notes, even things you threw away. I found inconsistencies. Large money transfers under your company name, but not signed by you. Ethan blinked. What are you saying? Someone used your signature. Someone forged your approval. Ethan's jaw tightened. He thought of Victor Hale, his business partner, his oldest friend. Grace continued. The transaction started 3 months before your arrest. Around the same time, your accounting director was suddenly transferred, and then disappeared. He frowned. Disappeared? Grace nodded. No one has seen him since. His name was on one of the documents. She hesitated. Ethan, I think someone set you up. Over the next few days, Grace kept digging. She visited offices, libraries, even old contacts from Ethan's staff who were too afraid to speak. Some slammed the door in her face. Others whispered hurriedly that she should stop before she got hurt. But Grace didn't stop. Every night after work, she sat under the dim light of her kitchen lamp, cross-checking files, making calls, printing records. She didn't sleep much. The fear was real, but the injustice burned hotter. One evening, as she left her apartment, a black SUV stopped at the corner. The window rolled down just an inch. A man's voice said, "You're digging where you shouldn't, Ms. Miller." Grace froze. Her heart pounded. "Leave the Graves case alone," the man continued. "You're a maid. Know your place." The SUV drove off, tires splashing through puddles, leaving her trembling in the rain. For a moment she wanted to turn back, to quit, to hide. But then she remembered Ethan's face, defeated and alone behind that cell wall. And she whispered to herself, "If I don't help him, who will?" The next morning, Grace returned to the courthouse carrying a worn folder filled with her findings. She demanded to speak to the public defender assigned to Ethan's case. The receptionist looked her up and down. "Ma'am, this office is for legal representatives only." Grace stood her ground. "Then call someone who cares about justice." Snickers echoed from nearby interns. One whispered, "She's insane. She's a maid, not a lawyer." Grace didn't flinch. "Maybe, but I'm the only one doing his lawyer's job." Moments later, a young attorney, Sandra Lee, stepped out. She was overworked, underpaid, and uninterested. "You said you have evidence?" Grace opened the folder on the counter. Documents neatly organized, highlighted, cross-referenced. "These show false transfers, forged signatures, and records linking Ethan's business partner, Victor Hale, to a shell company offshore." Sandra blinked, then sighed. "Ms. Miller, this is interesting. But without direct proof, it's circumstantial. I can't build a case on this." Grace's hands tightened. "Then I'll find you proof." Sandra looked at her, half amused, half concerned. "You can't just investigate corporate fraud. You'll get yourself in trouble." Grace met her gaze. "I already am." That night, Ethan received another visitor notice. When he saw Grace walk in again, exhausted but determined, he felt a rush of guilt. "You shouldn't be doing this," he said softly. "They'll come after you next." Grace smiled faintly. "They already tried." He leaned forward. "Grace, why? Why risk everything for me?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Because years ago, when my son was sick, you paid his hospital bill. You never told anyone. You didn't even let me thank you." Ethan's eyes widened. "That was you?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Yes, and I swore. One day, if I could ever repay you, I would." This is that day. Ethan was speechless. The woman he once thought invisible, the maid who passed through silent halls, was now the only person fighting for him. In the following days, Grace did something no one expected. She requested permission to testify in court as a witness for Ethan's defense. The judge was skeptical. The prosecution laughed, but she stood tall. "I was his employee," she said firmly. "I saw who he really was, and I have evidence that will show this court the truth." The courtroom murmured in disbelief. The maid, the one who scrubbed their floors, was now challenging the very men who had built this empire of lies. The judge sighed. "You're not an attorney, Ms. Miller. Are you sure you want to do this?" Grace's voice didn't tremble. "Yes, Your Honor, because if I don't stand up for him now, no one ever will." That was the day Grace Miller stopped being just a maid. She became a fighter, but what she didn't know was that the people she was going up against, men with deep pockets and darker secrets, were already planning to destroy her before she could take the stand. And they were willing to do anything to silence her. The courthouse was packed. Reporters filled every seat. Cameras lined the aisles. The air was thick with tension, anticipation, and the faint hum of whispered gossip. They were here to see a billionaire fall, but they didn't expect to witness a maid rise. Ethan Graves sat at the defense table in a wrinkled suit, wrists cuffed loosely before him. His face was pale, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Every lawyer he'd hired had abandoned him. No one wanted their name attached to a sinking ship. But beside him stood Grace Miller, wearing a simple navy dress and an old pair of shoes polished to a shine. She had no legal credentials, no degree, no training, just courage and a heart that refused to quit. The judge entered. "Court is now in session." Everyone rose. Grace's hands trembled slightly, but she kept her head high. She'd spent the last week studying every file, every loophole, every testimony she could find. Sandra, the overworked public defender, had agreed to let her speak, unofficially, as part of a character statement. But Grace had a plan far beyond that. She wasn't there just to defend Ethan's character. She was there to defend his truth. The prosecutor, Victor Hale's private attorney, smirked across the room. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we're ready to proceed with clear evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and willful deceit. Mr. Graves personally approved each illegal transaction." Grace's heart pounded as the prosecutor projected documents on the screen, each one signed E. Graves. The jury murmured. Ethan lowered his head. "It's over," he whispered. But Grace stood. Her voice, steady and strong, cut through the noise. "Your Honor, those signatures aren't his." The courtroom fell silent. The judge frowned. "Ms. Miller, you are not an attorney. You will only speak when—" "With respect, Your Honor," she said firmly. "I have evidence that proves these signatures were forged." Gasps rippled through the room. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed carefully, Ms. Miller." Grace stepped to the projector, holding a folder filled with her handwritten notes and photocopies. "These signatures," she began, "look identical. Every letter, every curve, every underline. But no human being signs their name exactly the same way twice. I know because I've cleaned his desk for years. I've seen his real handwriting on notes, letters, and thank you cards." She pulled out a small piece of paper, one she'd saved by instinct years ago, a grocery list Ethan had written to her during Christmas week. "This," she said softly, "is his real handwriting." The difference was clear. Ethan's true signature slanted naturally. The ones in the fraud documents were rigid, copied, mechanical. The prosecutor's smile faded. Grace continued, her confidence growing. "The man who framed him used printed scans of Ethan's signature to authorize transactions from a shell company in the Cayman Islands." "That company's name?" She looked up. "Hale Industries, LLC." The entire room gasped. Victor Hale, seated behind the prosecutor's bench, shifted uncomfortably. His lawyer stood. "Objection, Your Honor." "These claims are baseless." Grace didn't stop. "They're not baseless. I found payment receipts linking Hale Industries to the very accounts that transferred millions out of Graves Financial. Those accounts were created by Mr. Hale's assistant, 2 weeks before Ethan's arrest." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have proof of this?" Grace nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." She handed over a folder of documents, photocopies she had gathered from nights of quiet digging and phone calls. The judge examined them, then looked toward the prosecutor. "Do you have an explanation for this, counselor?" The prosecutor's voice faltered. "Your Honor, this evidence was not presented in discovery." "Because it was buried," Grace interrupted. "Because the people who set him up thought no one would ever go looking for the truth." She turned toward the jury. "But I did." Her voice softened, trembling now not with fear but with emotion. "Ethan Graves isn't perfect. He's made mistakes just like all of us. But he built a company that gave thousands of people jobs. He paid for his employees' children to go to school. He donated anonymously to hospitals and shelters. And when I couldn't afford my son's treatment, he paid the bill without ever asking for credit." A hush fell over the courtroom. Tears welled in her eyes. "You call that man a monster, a thief?" "No. He's a man who trusted the wrong friend. A man betrayed by the people closest to him." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "And if defending him makes me foolish, then I'll be the proudest fool in this courtroom." The jury sat in silence. Even Ethan, usually stoic, distant, looked at her like he was seeing sunlight for the first time in months. The judge finally spoke. "We will recess until tomorrow to review this new evidence." As the gavel struck, reporters rushed out to file their stories. The headline was already forming, "The Maid Who Defended a Billionaire." But outside, danger lurked. When Grace stepped down the courthouse steps that evening, her heart still racing from adrenaline, she noticed a car parked across the street. A man inside was watching her, phone in hand. Her phone buzzed. A text message flashed on the screen. "Stop digging." "Last warning." She froze. The rain began to fall again, slow and cold. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, took a deep breath, and whispered to herself, "You can scare me, but you can't stop me." That night, Ethan sat alone in his cell, his heart heavy, but alive again. For the first time since the trial began, he had hope. He thought of Grace, this woman who had no reason to fight for him, yet chose to stand taller than anyone else. He smiled faintly. "You're something else, Grace." But even as hope returned, shadows moved in the background. Victor Hale wasn't done. He had connections, power, and a desperate need to silence her before the truth came fully out. And before the next hearing, something terrible would happen that would test Grace's courage like never before. The rain hadn't stopped since the day Grace stood in court. It came down in sheets, drenching the city in gray silence. as if the heavens themselves were mourning what was about to unfold. Grace Miller sat at her kitchen table, a single lamp flickering above her. The folder of evidence lay open, photos, signatures, payment trails, everything she'd risked her safety to gather. She didn't know it yet, but that folder was worth more than gold, and far more dangerous. Across town, Victor Hale sat in his penthouse office watching the evening news. The courtroom erupted today as Grace Miller, a former maid, presented shocking evidence suggesting billionaire Ethan Graves may have been framed by his own partner. Hale's jaw tightened. She's going to ruin everything. His assistant, pale and nervous, stammered, "Sir, should I?" "Handle it," Hale snapped. "I don't care how." Meanwhile, Grace was on the phone with Sandra, the public defender. "I just got the judge's notice," Sandra said. "He's reopening the case file. The financial forensics team will recheck everything." Grace smiled faintly. "Then we're close." But before she could hang up, a sharp click echoed through her apartment door. Someone was there. Her heartbeat quickened. "Sandra, I think someone's—" The line went dead. The lights flickered once and went out. Footsteps, slow, heavy, coming closer. Grace's breath hitched as she grabbed the small kitchen knife from the table. "Who's there?" No answer. She backed toward the window, clutching the evidence folder to her chest. Then, a voice, smooth, cold, familiar. "You should have stayed a maid, Grace." Victor Hale stepped out of the shadows, his eyes burning with quiet fury. Two men stood behind him. Grace's voice shook. "How did you—" "I built that company," Hale interrupted. "Every contract, every handshake mine. And you think you can walk into my world and tear it down with your little files?" "You framed him," Grace said. "You destroyed his life." Hale chuckled darkly. "He destroyed himself when he trusted me." He took a step forward. "Hand over the evidence." Grace's grip tightened. "No!" One of the men lunged. Grace dodged, slashing his arm with the kitchen knife. Papers scattered across the floor. Another man grabbed her shoulder, but she broke free and bolted toward the stairwell. "Get her!" Hale shouted. Grace ran down the stairs, the echo of footsteps chasing her. Her heart pounded so loud she could barely hear anything else. She burst through the exit door into the rain-soaked street, clutching what remained of the folder. A passing taxi screeched to a stop. "Hey, you okay, lady?" The driver shouted. "Courthouse!" She gasped. "Please, drive." As the car sped through the city, Grace pressed her trembling hands over the folder. Half the papers were soaked, some torn. But one document, the most important one, survived. A signed statement authorizing the fake transfers bearing Hale's real signature. The irony burned. The man who framed Ethan had slipped up in his arrogance. By dawn, Grace reached the courthouse. Security guards were startled to see her, hair wet, clothes torn, eyes wild with fear. "I need to see the judge," she demanded, her voice breaking. "It's about the Graves case." The bailiff recognized her. "Ms. Miller, are you all right?" "No," she said honestly. "But I'm not stopping until he's free." Inside the judge's chambers, she placed the document on his desk. This is the proof." Victor Hale signed it himself. The judge's eyes widened. He called in 2 clerks immediately to verify. Within hours, law enforcement surrounded Hale's office. When he tried to flee, his assistant, terrified and desperate, confessed everything. It was all there: shell accounts, offshore payments, hidden property transfers, and falsified digital trails. Ethan Graves had been innocent all along. That afternoon, the courtroom was once again filled to the brim. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered. But this time the energy was different. Grace walked in wearing a fresh dress Sandra had bought her. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but relief. Ethan was escorted in moments later, no longer in cuffs. His eyes found hers immediately. When the judge announced the decision, "All charges against Mr. Ethan Graves are hereby dismissed," the courtroom erupted. Ethan turned toward Grace, disbelief in his voice. "You did it." Grace smiled through her tears. "No, we did it." The reporters swarmed them as they stepped outside. Questions flew from every direction. "Ms. Miller, how does it feel to prove him innocent?" "Mr. Graves, will you sue your partner?" "Grace, what made you believe in him when no one else did?" Grace paused on the courthouse steps, rain falling softly now. Her answer was simple, because the truth doesn't need a degree. Just needs someone brave enough to speak it. But even as she smiled, something inside her ached. The fear, the chase, the nights she spent alone, they'd taken a toll. And yet, as Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, she realized something. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She was a defender of truth. That evening, when Ethan was officially released, he didn't go back to his mansion. He asked the driver to take him to Grace's small apartment instead. She opened the door, still in disbelief that this was real. "I don't have much to offer, Mr. Graves," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "You offered me something I never had. Faith." He reached into his pocket and handed her a small white envelope. Inside was a check, but she didn't look at it. "I don't want your money," she said softly. He smiled. "It's not payment. It's partnership. I'm starting something new, a foundation that gives free legal aid to the innocent. And I want you to help lead it." Grace froze. "Me? You believed in justice when no one else did." "That's what this world needs." For the first time in years, she smiled, wide, genuine, and tearful. "Then let's do it." Outside, the storm had finally stopped. The clouds broke apart, sunlight spilling across the city skyline. The news headline that morning read, "The maid who defended a billionaire and changed justice forever." But to Ethan, and to everyone who saw her courage, she wasn't just a maid. She was Grace Miller, the woman who stood up when the world told her to kneel. Morning sunlight spilled through the courthouse windows, soft, golden, and warm. For the first time in months, Ethan Graves stood free. No handcuffs, no guards, no lies. The weight of betrayal had finally lifted. But the victory didn't feel like his alone. As he walked out into the open air, the world seemed quieter, cleaner. He breathed deeply, closing his eyes, remembering every moment Grace had stood between him and ruin. She had fought for him when the whole world turned away, and now he knew exactly what he had to do. 6 months later, the once broken skyscraper that bore his company's name had been stripped clean. The marble lobby no longer displayed Graves Financial. A new name was etched across the glass entrance, the Grace Foundation for Truth and Defense. Inside, the walls were lined with photos, not of Ethan's corporate triumphs, but of ordinary people. Single mothers, veterans, wrongfully accused workers, people who had been silenced because they didn't have money for lawyers. At the center of it all stood Grace Miller, no longer in a maid's uniform. She wore a navy blazer, her name on the glass office door, Director of Community Justice. She didn't like titles, but she loved what it stood for. Ethan entered the office quietly, holding 2 coffees. "Still don't like your name on the door?" he teased. Grace smiled. "Feels strange. I used to clean doors, not have my name on them." Ethan chuckled. "Well, I used to buy power. Now I invest in people. Guess we've both changed." She took the coffee from his hand. "Not changed," she said softly. "Just found what really matters." The foundation quickly became national news. Grace's story was featured on talk shows, documentaries, even college lectures about courage and justice. But every time reporters asked her, "How did you do it?" and her answer was always the same, "Because no one else would." Sometimes doing what's right means standing alone until the truth stands with you. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Ethan invited Grace to a charity event, the first one hosted by their foundation. The ballroom was filled with former defendants they had helped. Families reunited, workers cleared of false charges, small business owners given second chances. When Grace stepped onto the stage to speak, the crowd went silent. She looked out, not at wealth, not at prestige, but at faces that reminded her of where she'd come from. "I never dreamed I'd be standing here," she began. "I was a maid. I cleaned the offices of powerful people and believed my voice didn't matter. But one day, someone I worked for needed help. And I realized something." Her voice softened, trembling slightly. "Justice isn't about power. It's about courage. It's about standing up when the world tells you to sit down." Applause thundered across the room. Ethan watched her, pride glimmering in his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't the one being praised. And that felt right. After the event, they stepped out onto the balcony, the city lights flickering below. Grace leaned on the railing, looking at the skyline. "Do you ever miss it?" "Miss what?" Ethan asked. "The old life. The meetings, the control, the fame." He smiled faintly. "Not anymore. I used to think success was measured in dollars. But now I know. It's measured in who stands by you when you lose them all." Grace looked at him, her eyes warm. "Then I guess we both found success." They stood in silence for a moment. Two souls scarred by the same storm, now healed by truth. A year later, the foundation expanded to 6 states. Grace's initiative helped hundreds of falsely accused citizens. Ethan poured his resources into training programs for underprivileged youth, offering scholarships for aspiring lawyers from low-income families. On the anniversary of Ethan's acquittal, they held a memorial gala to honor those who fought for truth. When Grace arrived, Ethan greeted her with something unexpected. A bronze statue unveiled in the courtyard. It depicted a woman standing tall, holding a single document in her hand. The plaque read, "For those who speak when the world tells them to be silent, inspired by Grace Miller." Grace covered her mouth, eyes welling with tears. "Ethan, what is this?" He smiled softly. "It's a reminder. So the world never forgets that one brave voice can change everything." As the crowd applauded, Grace looked around, at the faces, the laughter, the light, and realized something profound. She hadn't just saved a man, she had saved the truth. And in doing so, she had rewritten her own story. Later that night, when the lights dimmed and the city quieted, Ethan and Grace stood alone under the marble statue. "Grace," Ethan said, his voice low, "you could have walked away. You didn't owe me anything." Grace smiled. "Maybe not. But I owed myself the chance to do what was right." He nodded slowly, emotion thick in his throat. "You changed my life." She looked at him, eyes soft. "No, Ethan. You gave me the chance to prove that even the smallest voice can echo louder than power." The night wind carried their silence. Not the silence of fear, but the peace of redemption. News headline 1 year later. From Maid to hero, Grace Miller's foundation changes the future of American justice. The world now knew her name. But Grace never wanted fame. She wanted fairness. She wanted truth. And above all, she wanted people to believe that courage doesn't wear suits or titles. It lives quietly in ordinary hearts, waiting for the moment it's needed most. A quiet afternoon. The courthouse steps, the same place where it all began. Grace stood there again, watching as a new case unfolded. A young woman, crying, held a folder close to her chest. Grace walked up and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't be afraid," Grace said softly. "I know how it feels to be unheard. But I promise, we'll fight for you." The woman nodded through her tears. Grace smiled, leading her up the steps, the same way she once climbed them alone. The camera panned up to the courthouse pillars, sunlight breaking through the clouds. And her voice echoed in the background. "I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't powerful. I was just someone who refused to let lies win. And sometimes, that's all justice really needs."